Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, capturing phenomenal landscape photos presented by Dr. Court Whelan. Court is NatHab's Director of Sustainability and Conservation Travel and has been leading trips around the world for us since 2013. Thanks for being with us today, Court. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thanks, Kendall, as always. And yeah, I was planning on putting the full title on this screen, but I had to shorten it because it started covering up those beautiful mountains and the fall foliage. I said, no, I've got to abbreviate. We got to cut it down a little bit, but rest assured, this is the intended presentation. So yeah, greetings from a beautiful day in Boulder, Colorado here. This is what it's going to look like here in our metaphorical backyard in a couple months once those aspens start turning yellow. So yeah, looking forward to that, as well as all sorts of other landscape photo opportunities. So I've got to say, I might be looking forward to this presentation most out of all those I've done recently, and I'll tell you why. As you know, as I was putting these slides together and putting all these landscape photos, like, wow, I mean, so many memories were being evoked. So many, one picture, they say a picture speaks 1,000 words, sometimes 10,000 words in a good landscape photo. But one photo kind of represented an entire feeling for me, an entire day, maybe even an entire trip. And I think that might explain, our general affinity for landscape photography, is that it can be so big, so memorable, so monumental that it might be kind of like one of the purest forms of photography out there. When you compare it with travel photography, which is kind of a newer thing, wildlife photography obviously is fantastic. Portrait photography is different, but landscape photography, I mean, it is, it's what Ansel Adams did. It's what the early forefathers of photography did and taught us to appreciate. So I'm really looking forward to this one today. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So again, landscape photography can evoke so many emotions. I really think it's probably one of the purest forms of photography out there. It might be one of the original forms. It is a way to capture your day, your hike, your vision from all sorts of different scenery. You can capture the feeling, the colors, everything about these scenes. And you can do it in a lot of different ways. These are just my photos and my opinions and my representations, but my hope is that they will give you the tools with which to make your own vision and your own artwork from. So you can incorporate, the perfect tree and the perfect little mountain brook at the exact right day. Here's a photo from up in the mountains behind Boulder, and this is just at the very, very start of an early snowfall, and everything was in the right place. And that's great, and that works well for landscape photography. And I think that you might initially be thinking, well, to do really, really good landscape photography, you've got to wait for the right time. You got to get up really early hours, or wait really late in the day, or spend days waiting for that snowfall, or whatever it may be. But that's not always the case. Sometimes great landscape photography is indeed capturing your vision. Maybe it's a very monotonous landscape, even though we're probably looking at more biodiversity in this one patch of forest than in the entire US. Here we are in Borneo in this photo. Nevertheless, my point here is that you can do amazing things with very simple landscapes and simple visions. Sometimes you could just choose dominant colors, dominant patterns, and have very small silhouettes of the mountains you think that might steal the show. So a lot of ability out there with landscape photography. So let's get right into it. I will also say I'm trying a new thing with my webcam. I attached my DSLR to my computer, so I have my Canon 5D and my nifty 50 lens. Kendall, is there a delay between the video and my audio?
Not on my end, no.
Okay, cool. I'm seeing it on my end. I apologize if it is, but this is a new thing. I'm trying a very pro level webcam setup, so hopefully it looks better. Regardless, let's go ahead and get into the gear here. So the gear for landscape photography, I'll very quickly glaze over the quintessential question or argument. I get a lot of questions on this is, do I upgrade from a point and shoot? How does this all work? I will say the very best camera in the world is the one you have with you. You've heard me say that many, many times. There is an advantage to point and shoots with landscape photography because, as you'll see in the coming slides, I'm a huge fan of using zoom and telephoto for my landscape photography. So you can use a wide angle 1 second, and with just a press of a button, you can zoom in and fill the screen in a really, really nice, compelling way with those point and shoots on, well, it's my left-hand side. I'm not sure which side of the screen. It's this way for me. But of course, the DSLR, the mirrorless, the fancy camera, we can change lenses, ultimately gives you a lot better quality photo. It gives you more data, especially if you're shooting in RAW, that you can then edit and post-process and bring out some of the colors and textures as you saw them in that scene. So again, just an example of a DSLR, more megapixels usually, bigger sensors, which means you can shoot at higher ISOs and in lower light. And as you'll hopefully see and come to realize, is some of those extreme hours of the day, you know, the mornings and the evenings can be some of the best time for lighting. So I shoot with the DSLR, that's my personal preference. So let's go into the lenses that you might choose if you are shooting with a camera that has interchangeable lenses. So there's a big difference in lenses out there, or sorry, in cameras out there between what we call a crop frame and a full frame. I've never really spent a lot of time covering this in my previous photo webinars, but I think it's important for landscape photography because if you want to get stellar landscape shots, it has to be crisp, it has to be big, it has to jump off the page, whether it's a web page, whether it's an actual print page. So the higher quality really goes an extremely long way. A full frame camera is going to be more of our pro level. They're going to be more expensive. More importantly, they have a bigger sensor, and you can get full frame and crop frame with DSLRs or mirrorless cameras. They're still available even with this newer technology. There's that line in the sand. Crop frames are generally more introductory cameras. They're more affordable, less expensive. They are not necessarily more durable or anything. In fact, full frames are often usually more hardily built. They're built for the elements. They're often weather sealed, but they're an easier entry point for a lot of folks that don't know if they want to take the plunge. As a result, this crop factor means your widest end of the spectrum is different. So these two lenses are actually very similar in terms of what you're going to see through the viewfinder. You see one goes to 18 millimeters and 124. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. We can, you know, take questions at the end, or you know, you can read one of my posts on the Natural Photographer. But the idea is that if you have a crop frame sensor, and you can easily Google this with your make and model, the ideal lens is going to be an 18 to 55 or somewhere in that range. And the ideal lens for a full frame camera, I believe, is a 24 to 105. In my core kit, so this page is my core kit, just as core as a wide angle is a good telephoto or a zoom lens, as you might call it. I personally use a 100 to 400, but as you'll see in this next slide, we've got some variants of all this. So this is kind of like my X factor, my next level for landscape photography. I'm not going to go anywhere without those previous lenses, but as long as I can fit these in my camera bag, as long as I have these and own these at the time, these are the next level lenses that I would like to consider bringing. So this one on the top left here, the 16 to 35, this is for a full frame camera. So the equivalent on a crop frame would be something in and around the 10 to 22 millimeter. This is what's known as an ultra wide angle. It's not a fisheye, it's still rectilinear, so it still has sharp corners and there's very little distortion, but it shoots very wide. And you might say, well, gosh, how much difference is there between 16 and 24? A lot. It's a lot more than you'd think. So what this does is it provides those big sweeping views. If you've ever seen the cover of, you know, Outdoor Photographer or some sort of landscape photography magazine or website, and you'll see these mountains in the background and then wildflowers in the foreground that are almost jumping out to you at the lens. That's because they have a very wide angle lens, and it does things that your more basic lenses or smartphones or more consumer level, less pro level cameras can do. Those cheaper cameras really can't get that field of view. These guys knock it out of the park. So my ultra wide angle is something I always bring with me. Not always totally necessary, but definitely an X factor lens for the X factor photos. And then, you know, the 100 400, I like it, and you'll see some photos here in a few minutes of sunsets and sunrises at 400 millimeters and why that's really important. But if I'm not going on a trip that also has wildlife, I might be able to get away with this 70 to 200 millimeter class. The reason I sometimes like 70 to 200s over the 100 to 400 is usually these 70 to 200s are sharper, which makes it better for landscape photography. When you have a more reduced focal range, usually all that money and all that technology of your glass goes into the quality of the glass and the quality of the ensuing photos. And then I do always bring my smartphone. It's great, you know, if I'm getting a photo or taking a time lapse or a delayed shot and I want to snap a couple other photos. Smartphones are not real great for wildlife photography where we do need zoom, but they're getting better and better all the time for landscape shots. So smartphone, a great second camera body. Stabilization. Normally, I also gloss over this because I'm not a huge fan of tripods, especially with wildlife photography and travel photography where we have to be nimble and moving around all the time. Landscape photography, like really real deal hardcore landscape photography, a tripod is quite essential. The reason is because you don't want to be limited by shutter speed. You don't want to be limited by shutter speed with wildlife photography, but you can only shoot so slow when you're shooting moving things like animals, like people, before the person or the wildlife becomes blurred. With landscapes, mountains don't move. Well, they do about a centimeter every 100 years, but they don't move that fast. And so you can shoot with really, really slow shutter speeds, and it takes that variable out of the equation. So a good tripod is quite essential. If you don't have a good tripod or prefer something lighter and smaller, a monopod can double as a walking stick. It also gives you a little bit of stabilization, but it doesn't quite cut it the same way a full tripod does, because you still have a moving axis from left to right. You won't move up and down, it's very stable and planted there, but left to right, there's some movement. What we usually say is a monopod takes out about 1 stop of stabilization. So what that means is if you needed to shoot something at 1/80 of a second to stabilize your hand movement, a monopod would take out 1 stop, and that means you can take that shutter speed and cut it in half, and you get the same shot with a monopod, so 1/40. The problem is I'm sometimes shooting at a half a second, and monopod just doesn't cut it. GorillaPod, this is just a name brand. There are a bunch of these guys out there on the market today. They're just small, lightweight travel pods, travel tripods that can fit in a backpack. They can weigh next to nothing, and they're good for trips where you just can't bring a full-size tripod. Filters, another thing I often glossed over, but again, if we're talking real deal landscape photography, there are 3 filters to consider. And I'm gonna go over later in the presentation examples with each as to when you would want to use them and how you wanna use them. But just to get the terminology out there, the 3 that you might wanna consider nowadays, and in my humble opinion, you can get rid of all the rest. They're not nearly as important. A neutral density filter, or known as an ND. This is basically like a sunglass tint. It's really good for getting those slow shutters of moving water. A polarizer is really good for landscapes with clouds and intermittent blue skies. And an ND grad, that's just the abbreviation for a graduated neutral density filter. Just couldn't fit on the page. No, we just call it an ND grad filter. And this is when you're shooting sunsets, sunrises, when there's a strong light difference between that which is above the horizon and that which is below. So think about oceans, think about sunsets over rocky shorelines. The sun, even though it's setting, it's still really, really bright, and the foreground might be a little bit shadowy. So what you can do is half of it is like a sunglass tint, and it just manually darkens half of the scene. I also put a variation of filters on here. Sometimes you can buy square filters that go into brackets. It's particularly useful for ND grad filters because sometimes you want that horizon to be 1/3 of the way rather than dead half in the middle. You can actually slide it up and down. These are often termed Lee filters. They can be rather pricey, but they definitely get the job done. We'll come back to this in a bit with examples. So the rest of the presentation I'm breaking down into techniques and then my tips and tricks. The techniques, the next several slides are going to be kind of you need to try to do these things at all times with landscape photography. The tips and tricks are going to be kind of like individual instances. How do you get that sunburst effect? How do you get the swirling, moving water effect? That sort of stuff. Techniques, these are things that you want to be incorporating with almost every landscape shot. The more of these things you can incorporate, the better your photographs are going to be. So the first one, I feel like I haven't done a single one of these webinars without mentioning the rule of thirds. It is absolutely critical. So I'm going to spend a little bit, just a couple seconds on this because it's one of the most important things for any kind of photography, but especially landscape photography. It's not anything you really need to think too long and hard about, but basically the idea, if you're not familiar with it already, is to break your scene down into thirds rather than halves. So oftentimes when we're just starting out in photography, we're very tempted to put that sunset or that animal, in the case of wildlife photography, smack dab in the middle of the scene. The point here is that you want to offset it and you want to think in thirds rather than halves. You want to think in thirds rather than quarters. And it has all to do with mathematics and this thing called the golden ratio or the Fibonacci sequence. It's something that you can check out in our Nature Photography 102 webinar from a couple months back. But basically, you want to break your scene down in thirds, either vertically or horizontally. You can see here how I sort of had the foreground with the grasses in 1/3, that midground with the water and some interesting trees in the middle third, and then pretty much the whole mountain. This is Denali in Alaska. The whole mountain is in that upper third. Rather than just putting that right smack dab in the middle, you're offsetting it. It has to do with rules and laws of aesthetics and mathematics. And then notice I'm also putting kind of the base of that big mountain right at one of those intersecting points. When and if you can, it always pays huge dividends if you can put something interesting at those intersecting points because of the way we see things and the way we visualize things, okay? The other rule of composition, again, you can use these things together if you can. Sometimes this is an if one or the other, is leading lines. It's great if you can do it all, but sometimes leading lines lend themselves to your composition of your photo. So here we are, we're in Zion National Park, and we've got the Virgin River here, and this Virgin River, this is the leading line that is leading you. You can follow my mouse here, is leading you towards the thing I'm really kind of showcasing here, the Watchman Tower mountain, so to speak. It's not really a mountain, but rather an eroded slab of old ocean rock. Join me on a trip and I'll explain the rest of that story. It's a pretty fascinating one. But basically what we're doing is we're using this river, this winding river, to kind of point your eyes and follow it to the centerpiece of the photo. You can do this with man-made structures too, and I particularly like this because you have really jagged straight lines with a lot of man-made structures. So here we are transported to the island of Borneo. We're in the rainforest, and I'm using the boardwalk walkway of our jungle lodge to kind of take your eyes on a path into the distance. Notice how I have the frame opened up with those trees in the background. The path kind of weaves its way, not real prominently, but just subtly, so your eyes kind of follow it into that distance, into that void, into the expanse that I'm really trying to showcase here. So leading lines are just using some sort of line, whether it's in the environment, it could be a tree, it could be a railroad track, it could be the handle of a car, who knows what it is, something that points towards the thing you would like to feature. Foreground elements are absolutely critical. Again, the more of these you can incorporate in your landscape photography, the better. I rarely take a landscape photo that I like that doesn't have something that I'm featuring other than the beautiful background. Now, of course, here we are in Antarctica, and there's a beautiful mountain. It's the blue hour, you know, just that time that gets that beautiful blue hue to the night sky after the sun has set, but before it's completely dark. And the mountain's great, but you need something more with a lot of landscape photography. That's where you see mountain meadows with flowers. That's where you see things like rivers in front of the Watchman Tower in Zion. It's when sometimes I like to put people or vehicles or wildlife as my foreground element. So keeping an eye out for foreground elements is really, really key. It also helps you choose what to focus on. We'll get back to that in just a second. So you don't have to have, you know, tents pitched in the middle of Antarctica to get foreground elements. Sometimes with the biggest scenery that we like to photograph, this is the Grand Canyon, North Rim, it's just picking out a certain part of that scene. So here we have, it's, again, Mount Hayden. There's no mountain building here. This is all erosion, but there's this kind of pinnacle, this spire that I'm really focusing on as my foreground element. Now, this is not a foreground element like a flower. It's not 2 feet in front of me. It's still way far away. I'm with a telephoto zoom lens here, but I'm picking one thing to really showcase and feature, just like I did with my leading lines, to tie the rest of the team together. Otherwise, with a scene like this, it's kind of hard as the viewer of your photograph to know where to look. You know, where am I looking? With a foreground element, you tell them where to look. You get a nice and sharp, crisp focus. You nail the lighting, and it's going to make your landscape photo that much better. I do like to provide a sense of scale. I think that's a great use of foreground elements. Now, that previous photo with Mount Hayden, you have no idea how big that is. That's actually probably like 5 or 6 stories. People spend hours rock climbing, where they probably once did. In this case, you know how big a guy is. You know how big a kayak is. It gives a great sense of scale. As a side thought, you know, incorporating people in your landscape photos, you might initially think, well, gosh, that's the last thing I want, you know, beautiful, pristine nature. Why would I want to put a person there or a vehicle? Well, it's more powerful than you think. It provides that great sense of scale. This massive ice cave in Antarctica, you would really have no idea how big that is. You know, this little iceberg in the foreground, you could say, well, that could be an ice cube, who knows? But with this kayaker in the photo, it makes this photo so much bigger. Foreground elements provide a sense of scale. Try to incorporate them in your photos. Lighting. So I'm going to get a little bit cheesy here. You've heard me say this before. This plays a huge part in all photography, particularly with landscape photography. Photography is all about lighting. Okay, so you could be in the most beautiful slot canyon, like we happen to be seeing here in Lower Antelope in Arizona, and it could be the middle of the night, a moonless night, completely dark, no stars, and what would the photo be? It would be nothing. It would be a black screen, or maybe slight shadows kind of weaving its way throughout. What we're photographing here is not really the sandstone, not really the trail. We're photographing how light plays on this trail. And let me tell you, light can get so dynamic. In this scene specifically, this sandstone is all part of the same formation. It's all the same color. There is no difference in color of that sandstone. It's the light coming through this 30-foot slot canyon, bouncing off, redirecting, mixing with the subtle nuances and the curvature, gradients and angles that make this such an amazing scene. Now, trust me, it's just amazing to see it in person. It's not the camera that pulls out these colors, but it is the light. So anyway, this is where I have to say, this is the cheesy part about photography, but it's so true, is with photography, it's all about the light. You are photographing what light does. So you have to start tuning your mind to seeing light in a different way. If you've ever looked out the window in a late afternoon and you've seen it's kind of yellow or kind of orange, you say, what's going on out there? And you walk out the door and it's this amazing sunset. You go, oh, that's what the light is. It's this beautiful, brilliant sunlight filtered through the clouds. Or maybe it's not even a sunset, it's a big thunderstorm approaching and you can see nothing but these blue, purple, gray thunderheads. It's that light filtering through those clouds that's creating this nice, soft, ambient, kind of yellowy, ominous light. You can take a photo of a throw pillow in that light and it looks really, really great. This canyon is really nothing special except the way light bounces throughout it. Got to focus on the light. Now, sometimes you can also harness the absence of dramatic light and focus on the even lighting. We love even lighting. As photographers, we actually really, really like cloudy days in a lot of cases. This is a misty, kind of cloudy morning in the rainforest of Borneo. I'm photographing up at one of these massive trees, and I'm using that sort of like absence of color and absence of light to make a dramatic scene. So again, there's no perfect way to harness light. Just if you were to design your own checklist for what to check off as you're going into your landscape photos, this is one of the biggest ones, is lighting. What we generally don't like is harsh top-down lighting. So this is a photo, or this is an example of a bad photo, frankly. It's pretty cool because we got llamas here and Machu Picchu is just around the corner, so it's a great memory. But generally, the problem here is it's very, very dramatic, harsh, very full sun lighting near the equator, very top down. It creates these dramatic shadows. Now, this is not a terrible photo. I'm not going to throw it away or get rid of it, but you notice how it just doesn't have that umph and that pizzazz. It's because top down harsh lighting, generally bad. Earlier mornings, late evenings, canyons, ways you can filter that light through canyons and kind of almost artificially create low angled light like a sunset or sunrise would be. Really, really great photography. And I have to say, if I may say it in a different part of this presentation, but if you are a budding landscape photographer, if you're a semi-pro landscape photographer and you want to go to one of the greatest places for landscape photography using these tools of light that I'm talking about, like in this previous couple of photos, canyons of the Southwest deserts in the US are probably one of the best ways to understand all these nuances of light and subjects and composition and foreground elements. It is one of the better places to cut your teeth, so to speak, with landscape photography. So getting back to this, that was just a tangential aside. Okay, we are often outside in the middle of the day. We are in locations for only a day or two. I was only in Machu Picchu for a couple of days here. Am I not going to spend the middle of the day photographing? No, I'm definitely going to photograph the middle of the day. But when I'm in these areas, one of the greatest ways to kind of make lemonade, so to speak, of really bright, harsh lighting conditions is to think in black and white photography. And now we've completely moved continents here and we're in the Kalahari of Botswana. But nevertheless, a great example of that late morning, kind of getting into the midday noon. We're headed back from safari to have our lunch, a little bit of downtime before we go back out in the evening. Think about that harsh lighting and exemplify the drama. Exemplify how harsh it really is, and convert your photos of black and white in the computer afterwards. It's a great little tip. Okay, so my go-to settings for landscape photography. Okay, now if you have a point and shoot camera, you can do all this as well. If you like easy buttons and you like to go into your camera's menu, this little icon I have in the top right is your icon you're looking for. This is known as landscape mode. It's even on some of the fancier cameras, and it basically does everything below that I'm mentioning here and prioritizes it with one click of a button. If you don't like using automatic settings, or if you do have a fancier camera and you can get into these nuanced settings within aperture and shutter speed, basically the formula is f8 or above, ISO not just low, but low, like get a real low ISO. We're talking about 100, 200, 400. I try to never go above 400. And then this is where that tripod really comes in handy, is that you're kind of taking shutter speed out of the equation. I rarely take shutter speed out of the equation because it's such an important part of travel photography, of wildlife photography. But with the tripod, you can set your ISO low, which is often the limiting factor, a high aperture to get that wide depth of field, So not just the shoreline, but that mountain in the background is in focus. And the shutter speed, so what if it's 1/20th of a second? You set it on a tripod and you're good. Setting your focus. This is a question I get a lot as well. Okay, so we're in front of this beautiful scene. I've got to focus on something. I personally never let my camera choose the focus. Camera settings are getting better in terms of figuring out what to focus on, especially with people and wildlife. With landscape, it's still not very great. The general rule of thumb is when you see a landscape like this, you want to photograph, you want to aim for about 1/3 of the distance to the edge of what you really care about being in focus. Okay, now there's these ideas of hyperfocus, and there are very, very fancy equations based on your focal length and all sorts of stuff. It's usually very close to exactly 1/3 of your perceived distance. Now, this is very subjective. You know, no one's taking out a tape measure and measuring exactly to that set of hoodoos to the Aquarius Plateau in the background. But generally thinking, you know, don't just pick anything at random. Pick about 1/3 of the distance from you to the edge of your scene. Now, important designation here is that is when you don't have a specific foreground element. So I just gave you a bunch of examples of a kayaker, of a certain tree or a bush or something that is your foreground element, a tent in Antarctica. When you have that prominent close foreground element, that is what you want in focus. One could argue that these hoodoos right here, if we go back and take that little focus dot away, you know, those are kind of my foreground element. That is what I'm really trying to showcase. It just happens to coincidentally also be more or less about 1/3 of the way into the distance there, where I just no longer care about focus out in the way, way, way dark background. Okay, cool. So now we go into specific tips and tricks with landscape photography. Remember, everything I've said so far, you could basically put it on a checklist, and if you can check them all off for a landscape photo, you're gonna get a great shot each and every time. But sometimes we wanna get a little bit next level, get a little more creative. The sunburst effect, this is something I really, really like. I think you'll see this in a lot of pro landscape photography. Here's an example I used photographing in the deserts of Escalante, just a little tent we set up for our Nat Hab group one night. So the trick is, it's really quite easy for the most part, is you want to set your camera on the biggest F number possible. So usually I'm shooting in aperture priority mode, biggest F number possible. And then I'm shooting to block about 50% of the sun. Okay, so what that means is I'm usually trying, 9 times out of 10, I'm trying to find some sort of structure, whether it's a cliff, whether it's a tent, whether it's a vehicle, whether it's a mountain or a tree, and I'm basically positioning myself to get where the sun's fully blocked, but within the step this way, the sun kind of completely peers out. You can, you know, use shadows in the ground as your guide, like, okay, clearly I can get that, but usually just by looking at the sun, you can figure out where you need to be positioned. And then of course, compose your shot as you'd like it, but the trick is you need that really, really narrow pinhole aperture. So I hate to break it to you, but folks that have point and shoots or iPhones, oftentimes it's very, very difficult to get this. You have to be at those big F numbers. Even F16 sometimes doesn't cut it. F22, it's usually the biggest number you can get. The narrowest little pinhole aperture is what you want. And then the sun about 50% blocked. Experiment. Next time you're out there and you see this, heck, you can probably go in your backyard tonight and do this if you have the sun fully out. And move around and experiment with what happens if you have only 1/4 of the sun blocked, or only 3/4 of the sun blocked, and see how bright it goes. These sunbeams will start to get wider and wider and wider the more sun that appears, really to the point where then it just overwhelms your whole scene. So a couple of caveats to that. One, if you have an optical viewfinder and you're photographing the sun, do not look directly at it in an optical viewfinder. It's just as damaging as if you look at the sun directly. A digital viewfinder, because you're looking at a screen, sometimes it's a little bit better, but be careful out there looking at the sun. Usually part of the biggest part of the learning is once you get in position, being able to close your eyes and take the shot so you don't get blinded temporarily or heck permanently. Don't do that. The other big thing is you will now find out how dirty your camera sensor is. So when the sun is that bright in your sensor, it's reflecting and refracting off every little dust particle and smudge. You can see here on the left-hand side, this is actually just a lens aberration. This is a color from the lens. It's kind of like in Hollywood movies when you see people panning across a desert and you see these like prisms. It's part of that, but then also you can see a couple little spots down here. This is just a small little microscopic speck of dirt on my sensor that I didn't clean off properly, and it does get a little bit magnified. So just keep that in mind. Okay, So next big tip is use your telephoto. Telephoto lenses are amazing for landscape photography. I think it's a really cool way to show certain features in dramatically big landscapes, or in sometimes very, very arid landscapes. So here I'm using kind of an exaggerated composition. I'm deliberately putting that horizon right in the middle of the frame, just personally because I like it. Rules are meant to be broken. And I'm putting this little stand of spruce trees with these long shadows right in the dead middle. And if you can actually kind of see a little bit of what we call sundog around the periphery of the sun here, and just showing the expanse of the tundra. I would not have been able to get this shot framed as is if I didn't have my 100 to 400 on my camera, because it was quite far away. It was way into the tundra, and I wanted to pick a spot that didn't have any other trees around, didn't have any other little aberrations to the soil or to the terrain. I wanted to show the flatness, and I had to use my telephoto to get that huge, huge, powerful thing. In addition, you get to do this really fun thing called zoom compression with your landscape photos if you have a big telephoto. And what I mean is, like, 300, 400, even 500 millimeters. People might laugh at me to say, yeah, take your 600 millimeter out photographing landscapes. But what you can do is, if you've ever seen those shots, a lot of them are on social media or online. Some of them are photoshopped and fake, but many of them are real, where you have like a city on a cliff and then the moon is like huge. It's like a massive moon. You say, how did they get that? That's fake. Some of them are, but some of them are real. And here's an example. I am not a perfectionist, or I might be a perfectionist. I'm not perfect at this, but this kind of shows you how I can make that sun bigger than it really appears, because I'm zooming into two different trees in a very, very distant landscape on the African savanna. These are very, very far away. Like, I even cropped this photo a little bit, but what it does is that ratio of your zoom actually makes those trees look normal sized. They're itty bitty in my eye, makes the trees look normal sized while keeping the sun at my normal field of view, and it makes the sun dramatically bigger. The only way to really understand this is to go out and try it yourself, and you're gonna see really, really cool results. The sun doesn't get much bigger or smaller as you zoom in, but the ratio of it to the landscape around it certainly does. It's really cool. Again, suns and moons, as they're celestial bodies and don't change size too dramatically, work really, really well for this. Telephotos and this idea of compression work really, really well for sunsets and sunrises as well. Oftentimes with sunsets and sunrises, it's great when we get these big, massive ones all over the sky, but oftentimes, they can be subdued on the horizon. Well, one great way to make them really, really pop is to use your zoom telephoto lens, or to zoom in on your point and shoot camera and fill the frame with those colors. And you'll be surprised if you zoom in dramatically how the shot can turn out. So my recipe for a shot like this is frame the shot first. So kind of get your idea. You have your zoom telephoto on, there's a couple trees over there, there's a mountain over here, whatever it may be. The sun is just behind those clouds, and the most colorful part is just between those two trees. So you framed it. You're gonna focus and meter on the sunset itself. Now, this could be the sun, but more often I find if you focus and meter on the really, really bright contrasty clouds, like you can see here, like the bright spot, it does even better. So I kind of wait for the sun to go to behind the clouds. Or if that's not exactly where you want to focus, you can do this extra trick where you use what's known as exposure lock. And this is a really, really good technique. I bet you some of you aren't familiar with this out there. You might have to look in your camera's manual. You might have to Google it or look on YouTube. But what you can do is you can push this little asterisk button. It usually appears as a button on your camera. It's in the menu. And as my camera goes blurred there. And what it does is it sets the meter, which means the camera chooses the light and dark scheme for you based on the sunset. So you aim it, same little focus box, hit the asterisk. It meters, so it brings out those really, really dramatic colors and textures. Otherwise, it'd be very, very washed out. And then it actually locks that exposure for about 15 seconds. Like, you can literally start counting and it'll go away 15 seconds later. In that time, you can then use your shutter button just like you always would to recompose the shot, focus where you want to, maybe then recompose it again. And so you've locked your metering to capture the colors of those clouds dramatically. It darkens the rest of the scene, makes the trees beautifully silhouetted, and you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too. It's a really, really great technique. So let me give you another example of why zoom telephotos and how you can truly make lemonade out of maybe sunsets that aren't quite as extraordinary as you might think they would be in photos. So here we are, sunset over the hills surrounding Copan, a Mayan ruin site in Honduras. It was a few years back. You can see a little bit of that zoom compression going on here. You know, the clouds, they don't really change size, but the ratio of the clouds to the trees make them look really, really big. Watch this. So this is the ending shot. I kind of cropped it so you can kind of see with the dark background. It's narrow. It's a little bit panoramic. You know, this is a shot a little bit further zoomed out. And this is actually how it was sitting on my veranda. This is what I was looking at. But I had my big beefy telephoto and I said, you know, there is some really cool color going on over there. I just can't see with my own eyes. I'm gonna use my zoom telephoto. I'm gonna get in on that and look what happened with that scene. Now you see with your naked eyes, the sun's way too bright. So the whole idea of metering, letting your camera choose the light and dark amount based on the sunset itself, it darkens everything to expose properly for the sun and the clouds and the brilliant orange. Otherwise, it would just turn out like a white sunset. So once again, it's obviously fantastic when you get sunsets like this. This is my ideal scenario. If I could order this up every night of the year, I certainly would. This is fall in my backyard in Boulder, Colorado, just a couple of years ago. And you can see, you know, these are 8,000 foot peaks. This is a big sunset and a big sky, but we don't always get that. The other thing with sunsets and sunrises, a great time to practice with white balance settings. I think this is really, really key to landscape photography because we do so much photography in the early and later parts of the day. So as an example, I'll show you more photos here in a second. This is white balance on a daylight setting. It's going to inject a little bit more blue into the scene. This is what you get when you put it on full auto, otherwise known as AWB. You can see a little bit more reds and purples and yellows, most importantly. That blue kind of goes away. And then very similar photo with it on cloudy settings, it injects a lot more yellow into an already very yellow sunset. So it almost looks fake. I mean, you know, it's kind of computerized here because I did force the white balance to be on an extreme condensation level. Basically what white balance is you know, you have a certain number of presets. I really oscillate between daylight, auto, and cloudy for all my photography, but it's really in the thousands of variations on this Kelvin scale, and they're preset on a spectrum from yellow to blue. This is something that I'm not going to spend a lot more time going into right now, but it's hugely important for all your photography and a great thing to practice on after this webinar, maybe this upcoming weekend, to see how it changes your scenes, particularly with sunrises and sunsets. Okay, so I promised that we would get into some filter talk and show how these things have examples in the real world. So neutral density, once again, is just kind of like a dark sunglass tint. Polarizer, I'll explain that in a second, but that has its own purpose. And then the graduated neutral density. First off, neutral density filters, they are the things necessary to make sure you can get that silky water effect each and every time. Okay, so what happens is when there's too much brightness in the scene, if you look at these camera settings up here, you know, my camera isn't going to be able to narrow that aperture down too much more. I can only go to like f22 or so. So I can't compensate for the brightness. You can see my ISO is already ridiculously low and I'm trying to blur it. I'm trying to get a lot of motion in the scene at 1 second. So what a neutral density does is it allows me to get back into kind of like a normal F range, or maybe, you know, without the neutral density filter on this shot, it would have been just way too bright. So neutral density filters are really, really key when you want to take long exposures in daylight conditions. You'll be surprised how much light comes through your sensor in 1 second, even at low ISOs. A neutral density filter, again, is just a dark uniform tint that you buy, you screw onto the tip of your lens, and it allows you to shoot normal shots at very long exposures. So the trick to this motion water exposure thing, again, tripod, it's a necessity. You can't handhold at 1 second. Usually a very low ISO, a relatively moderate f-stop, but really what you're doing is you're just prioritizing for a long exposure. Anywhere between 1/10 and 4 seconds is what I recommend out there. But also if you're looking at, you know, getting a little present for yourself, a birthday present or anything, you know, pick yourself up a neutral density filter. They come in sizes. You have to measure the tip of your lens. Usually on the lens, it'll tell you it's a 58 millimeter or a 67 or a 72, a 77, 82 millimeter, and that's the size you get. In addition, there are different stops in neutral density, and that's how dark it is. I recommend going somewhere pretty moderate in between, like a 6-stop neutral density filter. A polarizer. So what a polarizing filter technically does is it's like microscopic Venetian blinds. If you've ever bought polarized sunglasses, it's the same technology. The website or the person probably explained it in a better way than I am, but within that tinting, it's all in a very single plane of light being emitted. So you don't see this, but instead of light coming in at all different angles and scattering everywhere, it's coming in at one particular plane. Now, still a lot of light comes in, so it's still a bright photo. It barely darkens your photo, but what it does, the result, why we like it, is it gets these really nice kind of discernible edges to white clouds, and it darkens and saturates blue sky. It'll also kind of make more vibrancy in the scene, a little bit sharper greens, sharper textures. The biggest thing for sunglasses, you'll often see this with like fishing sunglasses, is it reduces the reflection on surfaces of water. In my experience, I haven't found that to be the useful part of polarizers in photography. It does that too, but usually we're not trying to do that unless you're really into coral reefs photography from above without diving and without a water housing. It's not that easy anyway. What it does, saturates blues in the sky, makes clouds nice and white and puffy. I don't use a polarizer very often, to be totally frank. A neutral density filter that is graduated, so it has that transition from dark to light. This is a classic example. So we've got sunset in Bryce Canyon National Park. Now, this looks all evenly lit, does it not? We've got the sun kind of coming over here on the left side, but nice even tones, even colors. That's because one of the other only filters I'll carry with me, I carry a neutral density and a graduated neutral density filter, is I put this on my lens and it darkens the sky, so there's not that strong contrast between a light sky and a dark foreground. So the sun's setting over here on my left-hand side, so it's very, very shadowy in the amphitheaters of Bryce Canyon. So as a result, with photography, you can't have your cake and eat it too with a bright sky and a dark scene unless you really force it by doing something manual. And again, these graduated neutral density filters are really fun to play around with. They have very limited applications, but those applications like sunset, sunrises, beach scenes, et cetera, they work really, really well. Now, I'll be honest, Photoshop is getting better and better every minute, and you can do most of this in Photoshop nowadays. So if you don't feel like buying a filter or carrying it around, you can replicate this in Photoshop. Not quite as good, but pretty darn good. So really, the only filter I find to be truly critical these days is the actual just straight up neutral density filter for those silky waterfalls. Another pro tip. So let's say you're in a slot canyon. Let's say you're in, it's early morning or dark evening and you just don't have enough light and you're noticing, look at these settings here on the right side, your camera, and this goes for people with point and shoots too. You just have to look at the settings in your camera. And my camera is giving 1/5 of a second for proper exposure, proper lighting. That's slow. That's very, very hard to handhold. One trick that I use if I don't have a tripod with me is I'll actually put my camera in burst mode, and then usually the second or third or fourth photo in burst mode actually turns out the best. And usually that's because, I've already kind of set myself, I've stabilized myself, I've already pushed the button, I've already lined up, I'm kind of tense, and I haven't moved as much in the second, third, or fourth shots in a row as I have for the very first shot. So it's not going to completely salvage if you don't have a tripod, but it's a really, really good opportunity. Put your camera in burst mode when you don't have a tripod in dark settings. This is a great tip. Back in the day, you'd have cable releases that you'd plug in your camera. Now they have infrared remotes that you can actually activate the shutter of your camera remotely, so you don't have to touch the camera. So this is when you're on a tripod and you are doing some sort of slow exposure. This could be 1/30 of a second all the way down to 30 seconds. If you don't have to push that shutter while the shutter is actually being released, you're going to get a much more stable shot. So what I do for any of my long exposure landscape photography is instead of trying to connect this infrared remote or a cable release and having one more piece of gear with me, I just put it on a 2-second timer. And that means I push it, I set up the shot and do all that, I push it, and then 2 seconds later it actually takes. That eliminates the need for that slight little bit of camera movement as I press the shutter. It's a really, really, really good technique, and it's a way to limit your gear when you're out in the field. So with that, I'm going to give you the biggest tip of all, is that there's a lot more to learn out there in the world of photography. This was a real crash course in all things landscape photography. If you want to learn more, I've got great resources on this website with Natural Habitat Adventures. It's our photo tutorial page. So feel free to bookmark that, sign up. And if you are interested in past webinars, I mentioned a couple here, like Nature Photography 102 that goes over some other tips and tricks. We have a whole suite of nature photography webinars that can be accessed through this link right here. And then also, I think Kendall uploaded the photo cheat sheet to this webinar, and that's downloadable via the GoToWebinar platform. There are some webinars that's not super applicable for. This one, it's very applicable. Pretty much everything in that photo cheat sheet is going to directly tie in to making your landscape photography better. So with that, I'll thank you and I'll take some questions.
Thank you, Court. We do have lots of questions. I'd like to remind folks that if they do have a question they want to submit, you can do that via the control panel in the questions field. Okay, first question. Can you please clarify crop factor? This person thinks they heard you should divide rather than multiply if you're using a full frame lens.
Kind of, yes. So that's a very, very good point. I actually do, I'm not trying to sell the natural photography website too much, but there's a great full article on that giving examples. I definitely recommend going there for like a 15-minute read and a 15-minute explanation. The basic gist is that a crop factor has a smaller sensor. It's essentially cheaper and easier to build a camera with a smaller sensor. It's also easier and cheaper to build lenses that work with a smaller sensor. It can be a little bit closer. As a result, what happens is you have to multiply the focal length by, if you're shooting on Canon, 1.6, so it's like 160%. If you're on Nikon, it's a 1.4 crop factor. For mirrorless cameras, it can be up to a 2 times crop factor. And I think Pentax maybe 1.5. So essentially, what you have is if you have, let's just say a Canon Rebel, and you have an 18 to 55 millimeter, what that turns into is 18 times 1.6, which I think is like 28. So you actually have a 28 millimeter lens, like in full frame equivalent. So the 24 on a full frame is wider. You'll get more edges and more scenery, more top to bottom, a bigger square, bigger rectangle technically, than the 18 on a crop frame sensor. So the good side is that they're lighter, they're cheaper, they're easier to use in some cases, they're less pro. The downside is that you don't get as much wide angle at your landscape photography needs. For wildlife photographers, often they will get crop frame sensors because it gives them that extra reach. So if you have a 400 millimeter lens with a crop factor sensor, crop frame sensor, like a Canon Rebel, you're actually like in the 600 millimeters in truth. Getting a 600 millimeter lens on a full frame camera is very big and very expensive. So there's a balance to it. At the end of the day, landscape photographers generally prefer full frame cameras because of the wide angle spectrum and because a bigger sensor on the full frames gives you better quality photos, just period.
Okay, great. There's a couple questions on polarizers, so I will combine them. Someone says they have a polarizer filter that rotates for different levels. Is it better to have a polarizer that does not do that? And second question is, how can you tell if the circular polarizer filter is working properly? Because it's hard to tell.
Sure. So I'll just be honest. First of all, I'm not a huge fan of polarizers. So yes, it pops out clouds, it brightens the blue and kind of saturates the blue. The thing is those things can be replicated in Photoshop or post-processing. What you can't do is take away those effects if you over polarize. So to the best of my knowledge, I think pretty much every polarizing filter out there is what's known as a circular polarizer, or at least most of the new ones. And so what that means is as you rotate it, what it is it's like it's too, okay, so you have these Venetian blinds, fully open, it's just normal light. But as you rotate it, it gets to be kind of like a different, more pronounced polarizing effect. And those blues start to get really, really saturated. And if you go too much, they turn into this gray, kind of like fake look. And again, the biggest problem is that it's hard to take that away in post-processing. Once you add it and take the photo, you're stuck with it. So hopefully that kind of answered the question. No, it's not better to get a non-rotational polarizer. If you're gonna do it, definitely get the rotational one. I don't really highly advocate for them. Did that answer the whole thing? I feel like there's a part I missed.
Well, the second part was, how can you tell if it's working properly when you're using it?
So you're kind of stuck to your optical viewfinder. It's a small little window, or the digital viewfinder. It's hard to tell. the way you'll tell it's working is if it darkens the photo. It's gonna look like a sunglass tint is gradually strengthening. There are more subtle nuances to it when you put it on a big screen, but just the fact that it's starting to darken. But the thing is, again, it's very easy to over polarize. It's very easy to make the photo look fake. So that's where you want to be super careful. I stick with the middle. Like if you can calibrate it, be like, okay, this is clearly not much, and this is a whole lot. Go in the halfway, and that's it.
Gotcha. When you're using Lightroom instead of an ND grad, do you underexpose the foreground so the sunset or sunrise is not overly bright?
Good question. What I do is it's always better and easier to lighten something that's dark than to darken something that's too light. So essentially, I would be bringing out the shadows of the dark part and lightening the dark part. So in that case of Bryce Canyon sunset, I'd be lightening the hoodoos and the canyons and the red rocks in the foreground, and I wouldn't really be touching the sunset, the clouds. You can decrease the highlights a little bit, and that helps, but you'll notice it starts to look bad and fake a lot faster than if you're lightening something that's too dark. So always, just a rule of thumb, Court's rule of thumb, lighten something that's dark rather than darken something that's light.
Got it. I've got some questions that are a little more specific for you. Using F8 or F11, and if I have a foreground, do I still focus a third in, or do I focus on the foreground?
So rules are always meant to be broken, but 19 times out of 20, focus on the foreground and ignore the background. Try it the other way and see if you like it. I think the best way to learn is take 2 shots. And then when you put it on the computer and you can see all the details, you'll probably gravitate to the one where the foreground is in crisp focus, because your eye is just so quickly drawn to the thing that's closest and most detailed. But there's always a reason to do the other way. I don't find them very often in my photography, but there have been a handful.
Okay. There's a couple questions on sunsets and sunrises on that note that I'll combine. What is your general f-stop and ISO shutter speed for sunrise and sunset? Underexposing them also enhances the red-orange colors. Do you ever do this? And
So,
second question is, how does it differ from white balance enhancement?
Great. So I'm gonna try to get all that. So basically my technique is underexposing the shot. So you're exactly right. I'm doing the underexposure in a different way. So you could take the shot and then just manually go to your exposure meter and then darken it and then take a test shot and then be like, it needs dark, dark, dark. What I find is that the shortcut, the fastest way there through the wormhole in space, is to just expose your photo perfectly for the sunset, and usually your camera nails the exposure and your adjustments are very, very minimal. When there have been some times when I'm shooting a sunset and I'm doing, the underexposure technique, and I have to change it like 4 or 5 times to get the right lighting. And that, if the sun's setting fast in the tropics, I lose the shot that I want, or if there's clouds moving. So yes, you're totally right there. Let's see. So what was the part on white balance?
How does it differ from white balance enhancement?
So white balance is a way for your camera's computer to calibrate for pure white. So pure white looks quite different pure white is different based on the light source. So if you're ever inside and taking photos with your smartphone, or back in the day with film cameras or earlier digital cameras, and you notice that like birthday parties and all that indoors are all like really, really yellow or really, really blue, it's because the tungsten bulb or the incandescent bulb or the fluorescent bulb is shining a different spectrum of white light onto everything, and your camera is getting confused to calibrate. So it's quite different than exposure. White balance is really a way to calibrate what pure white is given the lighting conditions. Pure white looks different under a yellow sun versus like a bluer moon. So yeah, quite different. Both indeed should be considered. And then gosh, I couldn't remember the first part of the question.
You're okay.
I get so excited about like the meat and potatoes of it. I just like run.
We'll move on. For lighting that's harsh, such as noon sun, like when you were talking about when you're at Machu Picchu, is it better to underexpose?
Yes. It's always better to underexpose than to overexpose. Not retain, or that relates directly to the question about the Photoshop question or Lightroom before with the graduated neutral density filter in Photoshop. Yes, it's always better from a software perspective to lighten dark stuff than to lighten dark stuff, or than to darken light stuff. Getting all sorts of things here. So yeah, in general, underexpose. Yeah, that's the key. And then, as I was just talking, I remember the first part of that question is general like shutter speed and aperture settings for sunsets and sunrises. It depends if you have a tripod, first and foremost. If you have a tripod, you're not limited by shutter speed. So then I'm shooting at, like f5.6, f8, and ISO 100. If I'm handheld, I am very cognizant of shutter speed, and I'm making sure that I'm shooting fast enough to hand stabilize, which usually means I'm trying not to shoot less than 1/80th of a second. And then if I dial that in, my camera usually gives me the aperture. The great thing about sunrises and sunsets is you don't need a big depth of field. You just really don't. You can get away with an f4, an f5.6 all day, and you're not going to notice the lack of definition. So given all that, I would always rather go for a lower ISO, but a shallower depth of field, because you're not going to notice the shallow depth of field. You're really going to notice the high ISO if you're forced to be higher. That's why tripods are a really good thing for these situations.
Great. For sunburst shots, would it be better to use the monitor to focus?
Yeah, kind of. So usually what I'm doing is I'm probably focusing on the foreground, like in that tent shot, I'm focusing on the tent pole, or I'm focusing on the tent itself. So I'm not actually focusing on the sun, and that stays my eyes, and it's really, really important. So you could use the monitor, and you looking at a screen, like that screen only has so many lumens, so it's not going to burn out your retinas like if you're looking at a sun. So yeah, it's totally safer and definitely default to use that. But when you're focusing and lining up the shot, you're probably not actually focusing on the sun itself. Focus on the tent, hold the shutter halfway, and then recompose your shot as you move and get halfway, and then shoot.
Okay. A couple more questions for you. There were a few people who were curious about UV filters and your thoughts on those.
Yeah, great question. I should have mentioned that. Yeah, a UV filter lives on my lens all day, every day. UV filters, I haven't found a lot of evidence or convincing arguments as to what they do, other than, yes, there's the science of UV light and all that, but really what they are is a lens protector. They're a cheap, inexpensive $20 lens protector. So if I drop my camera, heaven forbid, or if I scratch my lens, I'm just scratching the filter, a completely clear filter. And I didn't scratch a $1,000 lens, I scratched a $20, $30 filter. In addition, if you plan to resell your lenses later, which I do a lot, they retain their value. It's never been without a UV filter, and buyers, like serious buyers, will ask that. And then you just take your UV filter off, as you're showing the lens to a buyer, and the lens doesn't have a speck of dirt on it. It's perfectly clean. It's never been wiped down because it's been completely sealed off from the environment and the elements, because I've always had a UV filter on it.
Great. And would you recommend using HDR settings using Vivid?
I almost thought about putting HDR in this presentation. Quick thing. So again, if you want the 15-minute explanation, the Natural Photographer has a whole article on this. Just search HDR. It stands for high dynamic range. What it does, the science of it, is it takes 3 photos. Some of the modern cameras can actually do it all in one take, one shot, but the manual way is 3 photos. One is perfectly exposed, meaning like the right lighting. One is too dark and one is too light. And then software pulls all that data and makes the exposure more, in theory, more like what our eyes actually see. So the thing is our eyes perceive extraordinary dynamic range, meaning we see light and darkness and shadows in lightness way better than a digital instrument. So HDR has been a way to solve that. If used improperly, it can give your photos a bit of like a video game look, kind of like an artificial lighting. It looks just frankly like a video game screen. But they're getting better and better. And if you just do it softly, it's a great way to bring out some of the light in the darkness and to darken some of that lightness as well. So what the question was is, should you do it on vivid settings? Yes. So I think HDR makes a little bit of a surreal, very interesting photo right off the bat. So there are two schools of thought. One is that you don't really need vivid because it's already going to be on the edge of that kind of too computer generated. The other school of thought is like, heck yeah, do it. Your photo is going to already be super interesting and intriguing. So just push it to the limit. It's going to saturate it. It's going to bring out a lot of those colors. It's probably going to look a little bit over processed, but sometimes that can be really, really compelling once people already know. It's like, okay, so this is like an interesting artist rendition of this. So just push it to the limit. You could do so or not. I don't do a lot of HDR nowadays, just in full disclosure, because I find that the power in Photoshop and Lightroom to bring out some of those lights in the shadows works really well with the newer cameras.
Okay, great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I will call it there for questions, and I'll hand things back over to you, Court, for some closing comments.
Cool. Well, thank you. Well, gosh, yeah, what a fun presentation. Great questions, by the way. Again, there's so much more to cover on this because this is like the quintessential photography. It's like the purest form. So, we could talk for days on this. Although we don't have the time here, read up for days on the website below. It's got a lot of tips and tricks and examples to show you out there. Yeah, hopefully we can just get out there and be shooting together alongside one of these days. And again, if you are looking for a place and you say, gosh, I love landscape photography so much, I want to stack the deck in my favor. I want to go to the place where I'm going to get the best landscape photos easiest or most right away. It's got to be kind of like that trifecta of Canyonlands area in Utah and Arizona, the Zion, the Bryce, the Grand Canyon. It's the best way to develop your skills, I personally think, if you want to get into landscape photography a lot more.
Well, as always, this was fantastic, Court. Thank you. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. We did record today's presentation, so we'll have that replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.